You are approaching Saturn.
As someone whose first console was a Dreamcast, Sega's always had a special place in my heart, even after all the years of dumb decision-making in the decades since. As a result, the Sega Saturn's always been a source of endless fascination for me ever since I first learned of its existence. See, I grew up in what could charitably be called bumfuck nowhere, Wyoming, and gaming options were limited enough for the popular consoles. I wasn't even aware there was a 32-bit Sega console to begin with until I was probably about 11 or 12. So, 2006-ish? Imagine being a kid and learning that your favorite console maker had a whole console you didn't even know about. I felt like I'd discovered some lost piece of history learning about the Saturn. Alas, having made the far dumber purchase of Dragon Ball Final Bout for over $120 a bit before my discovery, you can imagine it was a hard sell to my parents to allow me to spend even more money on a mid-90s gaming console and its offensively expensive games. And with Saturn emulation in its infancy at the time, I was left Saturnless for years to come. Now that I'm older, but no wiser, I can finally describe myself as a proud Saturn owner. Sure, I had to get a Japanese one thanks to scalpers jacking the US Saturn prices up higher than Rob Van Dam gets with his 5-star Frog Splash. The point remains that I finally have one, which gives me the excuse to talk about one of the many exclusives to the system that kept me interested in the Saturn over the years, Dark Savior. Released in 1996 exclusively for the Saturn and developed by Climax Entertainment, makers of the excellent Landstalker and the Genesis, Dark Savior can be considered a sort of spiritual successor to Landstalker, even sharing the same director and chief programmer, Naito. Though I would say it's more so a spiritual successor in presentation than gameplay, with its isometric perspective placing sprites on a 3D plane. If you are looking for a spiritual successor in terms of gameplay, then I would recommend Alundra on the PS1. I should probably do a video on that at some point, but not today. Today it's all about Dark Savior. You play as Garion, your standard 90s anti-heroic badass, escorting the criminal blob monster thing, Bilan, to his execution on Jailer's Island. Naturally, things go wrong on the transport ship almost immediately after leaving port. Bilan breaks out and begins massacring everyone on board, putting Garion in a race against time to the captain's cabin. That's quite a literal race against time, by the way. It also leads me to the first interesting feature of Dark Savior, the branching story paths, or parallels as the game refers to it. If you take too long to get to the captain, not only is Garion too late to save anyone, but Bilan escapes with no way for Garion to warn the island of its impending doom, leading to Parallel 1, The Hunt for Evil. In this parallel, you'll be hot on Bilan's trail in an increasingly desperate pursuit to stop him before he becomes too powerful for anyone to defeat. This will almost certainly be the first story you experience, and was without a doubt the most grim timeline you will play through, with the deaths of numerous named characters being handed out like Halloween candy. It does, however, feature a few lighthearted moments, like a bit where you carry an unconscious lizard man through a labyrinth of traps and throw him around like you would with an object. I found this way funnier than I should have. Even better is the glitch that happens if you enter combat while you're carrying him. Oh, don't mind me, just fighting bipedal pigs while balancing a lizard man on my head. This is why being able to patch games after release isn't always for the best. Now what happens if you don't take your sweet time getting to the captain's cabin? Well, if you make it to the cabin between 3.5 to 4.5 minutes, Garion is able to defeat Bilan for good. However, he learns that Bilan was using the body of his own brother Luke as its host. And now Luke's body is rapidly breaking down from the molecular stress it put on him. This gives Garion the completely different goal of finding the Book of Uda, which contains the only known way to save Luke before it's too late. Thus begins Parallel 2, A Hunt for the Heart. This parallel is probably the longest one, both because of its actual length and because it was the introduction to the godforsaken minecart section, and the platforming hell of the Silver Castle, but I'll get to those later. In general, Parallel 2 feels a lot more like a classic RPG story with a more hopeful tone, as well as thrusting the would-be dictator, Warden Kurtligan, into the spotlight as the main villain this time around. Just look at those shoulder pads! Kurt's out here putting 80s NFL players to shame with those things. Finally, if you book it to the captain's cabin in less than 3.5 minutes, you'll actually beat Bilan there and lock him out. Apparently nobody had thought to try that on him before, because it actually works. While the monster still escapes the ship, they're able to transmit a warning to Jailer's Island this time, unlike in the first parallel, leading to Parallel 3, A Hunt for the Lies. This one's hard to talk about without discussing its ending, but suffice to say that Balan turns out to be a less pressing threat than he was the first time around. Before we get into spoiler territory though, we should probably do some talking about the game itself. As I'm sure you've noticed by now, Dark Savior is very... of its age. I don't want to call it ugly because, I mean, look at the detail on those sprites. Sprite-based graphics were the Saturn's bread and butter, and you can see it on display with the detail and depth of color on these things. But it's also hard to not notice how much the sprites contrast with some of the 3D assets, which have aged about as well as a carton of milk left out in the sun. Everyone was so obsessed with polygons at the time that pixel art styles like this were considered outdated. But you tell me what's aged better in this footage. The sprites that would only need some spit and polish for an HD remaster, or the full 3D objects like this rock. In fact, most of the best looking polygonal objects in the game look as good as they do because of the quality texture work rather than the bleeding edge tech rendering polygons at 2000 teraflops a second or whatever BS term that marketing loved using back then. At the end of the day though, it didn't take too long for my eyes to adjust to the graphics. Everything was clear enough that I never had trouble telling where I could and couldn't jump. Besides the handful of times Dark Savior decides to use the foreground to hide where I need to go. In professional circles, I believe this is known as a dick move. The rest of the time, the visuals do their job well enough without making my eyes bleed, and that's all I can really ask of older games. On to Dark Savior's second interesting feature, its hybrid gameplay styles. Where its predecessor was much more straightforward in its Zelda-like action with platforming elements, Dark Savior keeps the platforming while trading the Zelda inspiration for, of all things, Street Fighter. That's right, those clips I showed earlier weren't from a boss battle. That's how all combat encounters, save for exactly 2 rooms, play out. This will be the make or break part of the game for everyone. Most likely you'll either find it acceptable for what it is while enjoying the rest of what the game offers, or its shallow mechanics will turn you off entirely. You possess 3 attacks in total. A quick, close-range strike that does the least amount of damage, a turnaround strike for when your back is to the opponent, and a devastating medium-range swing that works as both a knockdown and a guard crush. There are also jumping and running attacks, but nothing more than an easy way to give the opponent room to counter, and as far as I could tell, are the exact same as your close range. Even if they were decent attacks though, there's really no reason to use anything besides the medium-range attack. It has great reach, it makes guarding opponents stumble, and it leaves them open for a second medium to knock them down. Rinse and repeat until your opponent is down for the count. Needless to say, Dark Savior isn't bound for Evo anytime soon. It does try to vary things up by giving Garion the ability to capture opponents and use them to fight, but they all control the same, and once Garion starts getting equipable upgrades, your captures are swiftly outdated. Not to mention that it's still a game over if you lose a fight regardless of if you're using a captured character or not. I think the explanation is that Garion's ability is more that he's copying them and not necessarily capturing them literally to use as fighters. But unless I missed a bit of dialogue, that fact wasn't very clear. It seems like a real wasted opportunity to have a whole system around this where your captured fighters could function as extra lives for tougher fights. Trust me, being threatened with a game over for any loss makes you inclined to stick with the cheap tactics that work over experimenting with different strategies. The good thing is that the focus isn't on these fights, to the point that the game actually gives you the option to skip most of them in exchange for bounty points, Dark Savior's version of XP. The real focus is on platforming and some light puzzle solving. The puzzles are, definitely puzzles. I'll be frank here, I'm a linear thinker. In other words, a dumbass when it comes to puzzles unless my first assumption is the correct approach. And it rarely is. So I'm not the right person to comment on the quality of Dark Savior's puzzles. There wasn't anything that really made me scratch my head, which probably means it's on the easy side, but I don't feel comfortable saying for sure. Dark Savior's meatiest element is in its platforming. Speaking as a man with extremely crappy depth perception, isometric platforming is typically absolute hell for me. This wasn't the case with Dark Savior though, strangely enough. While part of it may be from my enjoyment of its predecessor, Dark Savior feels even better when platforming. The controls are super responsive even when making awkward L-shaped jumps that I wouldn't have the balls to even try in similar games. Outside the accursed silver castle and some awkward jumps in the sewers, I had little trouble telling where I was in relation to platforms. It helps a lot when everything is clearly grid-based and your character has a shadow beneath them that you can use to gauge where they'll land. I don't understand why this was such a hard thing to include in older games. Even Landstalker had this issue not having a shadow beneath the main character's feet. I'm sure there's a legitimate programming reason for it. Nobody with a functioning brain intentionally makes it hard to tell where your character is, but I lack the expertise to know why for sure. Overall, the platforming is far and away the most polished part of Dark Savior's gameplay. If I had to pick one aspect I absolutely hate though, it would have to be the way your partner Jack will take 20 bounty points away from you every time you fall in a pit. BP is not easy to come by to begin with, as the only way to get more is through the limited combat encounters. There's also the fact that you need lots of BP to increase Garion's max health, so every missed jump quickly turns into a source of stress and anxiety as you wonder if you'll have enough for an upgrade, or if you'll need to face off against the final boss with barely any more health than you had back on the ship. I would have much preferred if you simply lost health when you missed a jump. Dark Savior already has different health bars for the overworld and combat encounters anyways, so it's not like you'd be going into battle with next to no health after a hard bit of platforming. Alright, we're in spoiler territory from here on out, so if you care about spoilers to a nearly 30-year-old game, then you'll want to go ahead and skip to this point. It's okay, I still love you. While Parallel 3 starts very similar to Parallel 1, it quickly takes a turn as the main divergence is with the death of Bruno, the more level-headed leader of the prisoner resistance against Kurtligan, at the hands of Bilan. This leaves nobody to stop the more fanatical JJ, who bears a striking resemblance to an ancient meme, from executing his idea, Plan D. This time around, Kurtligan winds up being the closest thing you have to an ally as you form an uneasy alliance, first to stop Bilan, then to stop JJ. However, you wind up being too late to stop JJ from completing his plan of resurrecting his cryogenically frozen boss, DeBose, who swiftly kills Kurtligan before reviving the other frozen prisoners, including Garion himself? That's right, kids. There's a reason the branching stories have been called parallels. They've all happened, and the space-time condominium can't take anymore. Welcome to Parallel 4, the hunt for truth. See, it turns out that there was another point of divergence outside of the parallels you've been playing. Early on in every parallel, you're forced to drink what's clearly supposed to be alcohol but got censored to jalapeno juice in the English translation. And eventually, Garion drunkenly tries to attack a child he mistakes for Bilan. In the versions you play, he's stopped each time by a blue rose thrown at him by the ninja K. She's the other one on the Ugliest Sin box art, by the way. But in the timeline of the one dubbed Carbon Garion, K is nowhere to be found and he straight up murders a kid. Can't show our hero drinking even when it's portrayed as a negative, but child murder's A-OK. This message brought to you by the ESRB. Anyways, due to the time-traveling rule that the two selves must never meet, Garion's body begins breaking down on him, giving him exactly 1 hour to find Carbon Garion and defeat him before it's too late. But wouldn't you know it, his bounty hunter buddies from the opening cutscene picked now of all times to come looking for him. So now he has to save all 4 of them as well as find his doppelganger in less than 1 hour. Once again, that time limit is quite literal. That same clock from the beginning reappears and you now have 1 real-life hour to race across the map, beat all the bosses, save your friends, and defeat Carbon Garion. Oh, and there's no saving. I repeat.
You cannot save even once.
That means every time you fail, you need to watch the entire intro cutscene to Parallel 4 all over again before getting another stab at it. And trust me, you will fail. To make things even more stress-inducing, at certain points, one of your friends will be killed if you aren't fast enough. Even if you don't give a crap about them, saving them does net you an extra 5 minutes, plus the BP you earn from the fight that you will definitely need as you panic jump your way through routes you could take your time with in the rest of the game. This includes, and actually starts with, the Silver Castle. I hate the Silver Castle so much. I hate its ugly aesthetic. I hate its reliance on camera trickery to hide where you need to go. And I especially hate how this is the only real area of the game to try for more than square or rectangular platforms. Why is this a problem? Well, it just happens that Dark Savior doesn't have real 3D movement. You can go up and left, up and right, down and left, or down and right. So imagine how much of a nightmare it is crossing these stupid curved walkways while zigzagging like a jackass. I had enough trouble with it in Parallel 2, but to add in a time limit and make you do it all over again if you die, that's downright evil. I'm not ashamed to admit that I had to use an emulator with save states to make it through this segment. If I had all the time in the world, I'm sure I could eventually manage it legit, But who would I be doing that for? I play video games to have fun, and having to go through several minutes of dialogue before I can even try the obstacle course from hell again is not my idea of fun. Buried underneath all this frustration, though, is an unexpected storytelling angle from what seems to be on the surface to be a straightforward story. Brief moments of timelines intersecting during Parallel 4 imply the events of other parallels were affected by this one, possibly implying that there's a prime parallel among them. There are heavy implications that Carbon Garion is in fact the original, and several enemies in Parallel 4 label him as the titular Dark Savior, and that is the only title drop in the entire story. Plus, a conversation with Jack in Parallel 2 suggests that people continue to dream after being cryogenically frozen. So does that mean the entire game you've played up to that point has been the remorseful dreams of Garion, longing for someone to have stopped him before it was too late? Maybe, maybe not. Dark Savior never truly answers that question. After the final credits of Parallel 4, just like it does in Parallels 1 and 2, the game opens back up on the ship with Garion waking from a dream right as Balan escapes from his cage, ready for you to start another run. There is actually one more secret parallel that you can unlock. Unfortunately, it's just a glorified boss rush without any real story to it, which does make a sort of sense since it requires you to purposefully lose to Balan in the Parallel 2 version of your fight with him on the ship. There are a few bits of pre-fight dialogue that seem to reveal things about certain foes who weren't exactly talkative the first time around, including the only time Balan actually speaks. But it's hard to tell if this is canon to the rest of the game or if it's just the devs having fun with what's essentially a bonus mode. To my knowledge, all beating Parallel 5 does is unlock a 2-player battle mode and give you a swanky 5th star on your save file. As my saves are, sadly, bereft of a 5th star, you can probably guess that I didn't beat it. So why did I pick this game to talk about in the first place? Do I think Dark Savior is worth playing today? It depends. Are you a weirdo like me who finds experimental games like this absolutely fascinating? Then I would definitely say give it a go if you can track down a copy. I got mine for less than $50 on eBay. As for everyone else, well, first of all, I'm shocked that you stuck around this long to listen to me rambling about an obscure Saturn game, and I thank you for that. But there are definitely better games out there from around this era compared to Dark Savior. A couple of them even made by the same developer, in fact. In short, it's a cult classic for the right kind of gamer. But I doubt that there are all that many of my kind left out there. Though there is a ton of potential here, and I would love it if games like this were the ones getting the remake treatment instead of the games that were already great in the first place. But that's a pipe dream. Oh well, I'll have to be content to enjoy all my neat, obscure games as they are. I can't really think of any decent sign-off. So, see you next time? Please? I'll be your friend.